Thomas, at the age of 10, was a contradiction wrapped in a vibrant canvas of life. He possessed a quick, analytical mind, hair the color of rich mahogany, and a laugh that could clear the clouds from a rainy afternoon. Yet, beneath this charm lay a terrifying instability, a temper that erupted with the force and speed of a volcanic tremor. His anger wasn't a slow boil. It was instantaneous combustion, burning away reason and leaving behind scorched earth. When the rage came, Thomas felt it first as a physical violation, a blinding heat behind his eyes, a violent clenching in his stomach, and a sound like rushing water in his ears that drowned out every gentle voice. In those moments he wasn't Thomas. He was a savage, focused only on inflicting the quickest, most profound pain to quell the fire in his chest. His primary weapon was his voice. He could find a verbal Achilles heel of anyone in the room, a mean-spirited brilliance that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving him horrified by his own actions. His victims were almost always his family, his mother, Ilara, who bore his cruel words with stoic, trembling silence, and his little sister, Lily, a shy, 6-year-old artist whose drawings would crumple in her small hands the instant Thomas's voice rose. The aftermath was always the same. Thomas would collapse into weeping, genuine remorse, promising change, while Ilara and David, his father, engaged in the quiet, heartbreaking work of emotional triage. David, a carpenter whose hands knew the value of smooth wood and patient construction, watched this cycle with an ache of recognition. He saw not just Thomas, but a ghost of his own younger self, he thought he had long ago planed, smooth and discarded. He knew that Thomas's heart wasn't bad, but the structure of his self-control was fundamentally unsound. It needed an anchor. It needed a physical, unforgettable manifestation of the damage he wrought. The breaking point came in mid-October. Thomas was building an elaborate fort in the living room. Lily, wanting to contribute, accidentally knocked over a tower of pillows. Thomas's face went instantly gray. He didn't just shout. He unleashed a torrent of specific, calculated cruelty about Lily's intelligence, her clumsiness, and her worthlessness to his game. Lily didn't cry. She froze, her eyes wide and wet, before retreating, not to her room, but hiding behind the heavy folds of the dining room curtain, where her small, rapid breaths were the only sound. David walked over, knelt by the curtain, and simply lifted Lily into his arms. He carried her out of the room, leaving Thomas alone in the ruins of the fort. Later that evening, the air thick with unspoken failure, David sat Thomas down in the cool, sawdust-scented quiet of his basement workshop. David was not angry. His silence was heavier than any shout. "Thomas," David said, his voice the low, resonant sound of solid oak, "the fire is inside you, but the destruction is outside. We need to bridge that gap. We need to make the invisible wounds visible." David retrieved a few objects, a bag of common, 8-penny iron nails, hundreds of them, and his favorite well-worn hammer, the head polished and the oak handle darkened with years of sweat and honest work. He then led Thomas out back, to the furthest corner of their property, where a rough, weathered cedar fence marked the boundary with the untended neighboring lot. "This is our canvas," David stated. "A silent, sturdy witness. Every single time you allow the fire to take you, every time you speak an angry word or act with destructive spite, he will come here. You will take one of these nails, and you will drive it fully into this fence." Thomas stared at the task. It seemed absurd, yet the absolute seriousness in his father's eyes, the quiet knowledge, prevented him from arguing. It wasn't a punishment. It was a grueling, physical ritual of confession. To understand the severity of David's assignment, one must understand the scar he carried. David's own childhood was marked by a similar volatility, particularly towards his late father, Elias, a stern but loving man. David had been ambitious, eager to leave their small town and attend a distant engineering college. A dream Elias strongly opposed, wishing David to remain close and eventually take over the family hardware store. The final, fatal argument happened over the phone during David's sophomore year. Elias, ailing and proud, had called to express his disappointment that David had changed his major from engineering to carpentry, a field Elias viewed as common labor. David, consumed by the arrogance of youth and the pressure of university life, retaliated with a calculated, wounding verbal attack. "Your small-minded father," David had spat. "You want me to stay because you're afraid to see me succeed, afraid to be left behind by the world." The line had gone silent. David waited for the counter-assault, but it never came. Elias simply said, in a voice hollowed of all emotion, "I see. Goodbye, son." Elias died of a sudden, unexpected heart attack 3 months later. David rushed home, consumed by a crippling, agonizing guilt. He apologized constantly to the empty air, but the words were useless. The damage was done. Weeks after the funeral, David was in the backyard of the old family home. He was burning trash when he noticed a small, barely visible hole in the wooden shed behind the house. Curious, he dug at it with a knife until he found the object, a rusted, ancient nail, driven deep into the wood. He recognized the spot. It was from a long-forgotten fight he'd had with Elias when David was 7, over a broken toy. David had screamed, and Elias, without a word, had gone to the shed and hammered a nail into the wood. David had forgotten the incident entirely until that moment. Searching the shed, David found 6 more nails, each representing a moment of fury he had unleashed on his father over the years. Elias had never mentioned them, never used them as leverage, but had silently carried the burden of cataloging the wounds. The last hole, however, had no nail. It was just a black, jagged fissure where the wood had cracked. Created, David realized, with a fresh wave of grief, by the final, unforgivable words spoken over the phone. The words are the nails. Elias's silent lesson echoed through the years, and the final wound cracked the wood. This inheritance was why David chose the cedar fence for Thomas. It wasn't merely a teaching tool. It was the transference of a profound, painful wisdom. He knew that Thomas needed to feel the physical cost of verbal violence, the resistance of the wood acting as the resistance of the human spirit when under attack. Thomas began his assignment the very next morning. The first day was the most brutal education of his life. The fence plank he was assigned was thick and unforgiving. The first time he lost his temper, a quick snarl at Alara for a burnt piece of toast, he ran out with a nail. The hammer felt heavy, unwieldy. He swung clumsily, denting the wood, bending the soft iron of the nail's head, before finally driving it home. The force required was astonishing. He had to lift, aim, and strike again and again, the vibrations stinging his palms. By noon, the fence panel looked like a target board gone wrong. Nail 1:08 a.m. burnt toast. A single resentful jab. Nail 8:11 a.m. A screaming match with Lily over a shared art supply. This one was driven with vicious force, splintering the wood around the head. Nail 15:03 p.m. A sustained fit of self-pity after a poor grade at school. He pounded this one until the metal was flush with the cedar. His fury temporarily redirected. By the end of that first day, 37 nails stood sentinel in the wood. Thomas stood back, his arms throbbing, his mind reeling. 37 explosions. 37 moments of selfish cruelty. 37 instances where he had shattered the calm of his family. The sight of the nails was a physical representation of the emotional chaos he usually inflicted and then promptly forgot. The weight of the hammer became symbolic. He realized the ease of shouting versus the difficulty of the physical act. Shouting required nothing but an open mouth and an open wound. Hammering required effort, pain, and time. The second week introduced a psychological strain. Thomas had to walk past the ravaged fence every day. He felt genuine, deep shame. The nails weren't just a record of his anger. They were public failures in his private life. He even started comparing his fence to the neighbor's flawless white boundary. Cheney's fence was a mockery of his own ruined, spiked reality. His internal dialogue became a complex calculation. Is this frustration worth the walk to the yard? Is this petty grievance worth the aching forearm and the shame of another nail? This was the core of David's genius. The assignment forced Thomas to defer the pain, instead of the immediate, satisfying catharsis of yelling. Thomas now had to process the resulting pain, the physical effort, the exhaustion, the visual evidence after the fact. The hammer forced a necessary connection between the action and the consequence. Slowly, arduously, the numbers dwindled. The fence panels closest to the house were saturated, a testimony to his history. But the panels further down, those reached in the 3rd and 4th week, bore only scattered, lonely nails. He learned to manage small irritations. When Lily accidentally spilled his water glass, the old Thomas would have screamed. The new Thomas paused, felt the familiar fire, and then looked at his palm, remembering the hammer's handle. He simply stood up and cleaned the spill. No nail was hammered. The feeling of success was a clean, cool sensation, far superior to the heat of the rage. The daily tally dropped to 5, then 2, then 0. He began to track the number with meticulous pride. 6 days with no nails, then 10, then 14. The discipline became a source of powerful, quiet dignity. Finally, after 5 grueling months that had spanned the wet chill of winter and the first tentative green of spring, Thomas ran to his father holding a handwritten sheet of paper. "Father," Thomas announced, his voice steady, "I have gone 21 days without striking a single nail. I am free of the temper. David's smile was warm, but his eyes held a strange, sad seriousness. You have achieved a great victory, my son, but your work is not yet complete. Now, for every day you maintain your control, you must pull one nail out of the fence. The second phase of the lesson began, redemption. Thomas found that pulling the nails was easier than driving them, but the process was still slow and meticulous. He used the claw of the hammer, levering the metal free. Shhht. The sound was satisfying. The noise of a burden lifted, but as the nails came out, the true damage became undeniably clear. He had expected the wood underneath to spring back, to heal, to magically forget the violation. Instead, the fence was riddled with black, permanent pits. The holes were not uniform. Some were clean punctures, the wounds of quick, thoughtless snaps. Others were jagged, wide scars, surrounded by splintered wood, the remnants of the times he had driven the nails with brutal, unrestrained force. The fence was no longer a structure. It was a museum of his past failures. Thomas spent weeks in the yard, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, enduring ache of regret. He examined the holes, mentally assigning each one to an event. A word, a person. This jagged one is for when I told Lily her drawings were trash. That deep pit is for when I shouted at Mum in front of her friends. This knot of splinters is for when I refused to speak to Dad for an entire day. He started, involving Lily in the process. He never mentioned the context of the nails, only the task. Lily, he'd say gently, I'm pulling this out today because I kept my promise and didn't yell. Can you fill the hole with this wood putty? Lily, still shy around him, would carefully push the beige putty into the dark cavity. The putty didn't make the wood new. It merely filled the empty space, leaving a smooth, noticeable patch of a different color. It was a scar, but a healed scar. It was better than a gaping wound. One day, Thomas was struggling to remove a particularly bent and rusted nail. It was one of the first, driven in with blinding fury, and the head was barely above the wood. He worked on it for half an hour, using pliers, struggling, sweating, until the nail finally broke off, leaving the point of the shank permanently embedded deep inside the cedar. He stared at the partial nail, a jagged piece of metal forever trapped within the wood. He realized some wounds simply cannot be fully extracted. Some things said cannot ever be fully taken back. They remain, a tiny, buried fragment of poison. The lesson became infinitely more powerful now that the immediate consequences, the physical pain of hammering, were gone. Now, the consequence was enduring visible damage. He had learned restraint from the hammering, but he learned reverence for others' feelings from the holes. Finally, one bright summer morning, the fence was empty of all removable nails. Thomas stood before his father, the cloth bag now containing hundreds of rusted, bent nails heavy in his hand. Father, Thomas whispered, handing over the bag, it is finished. Every nail is gone. David took the bag, the metal clinking softly, the sound of a long war concluding. He placed the bag down and led Thomas to the fence one last time. The sun was high, illuminating the fence in stark detail. The wood was a complex, beautiful tapestry of light cedar, dark pits, and beige putty patches. It was structurally sound, but visually, it was an undeniable ruin. You have done better than I could have imagined, my son, David said, placing a heavy, loving hand on Thomas's shoulder. You have learned self-control. You have wrestled the fire and won. David traced the outline of a particularly large, splintered hole near the top rail. But look here, Thomas. Look at the scars. The fence is safe, but it will never be the same as it was the day we began. The damage is permanent. Thomas could only stare, a profound sorrow settling into his soul. When you use words in anger, Thomas, they are like those nails. They are driven into the heart, into the spirit, into the memory of the person you love. The apology, the act of pulling the nail out, is vital. It stops the immediate pain and allows the work of filling the hole to begin. But the hole remains. The person you hurt will always carry the memory of where that nail was placed. David looked down at his son, his eyes full of the painful wisdom inherited from his own past. You can put a knife in a man and draw it out. You can say I'm sorry 10,000 times. But the wound, the breach of trust, the moment of terror, the self-doubt you injected it, is still there, beneath the surface. Thomas understood. His chest ached, not with the heat of his old anger, but with the cold certainty of his past cruelty. He looked up at David, his voice thick with tears. I hope you can forgive me, Father, Thomas whispered, his gaze sweeping over the fence, a reflection of the heart of his family. I hope you can forgive me for the holes I put in you, and in Mother, and in Lily. David pulled his son into a tight, long embrace, smelling the faint trace of cedar and earth on Thomas's clothes. "Of course, I forgive you, Thomas. The love between us is the only thing strong enough to hold the wood together despite the holes. Forgiveness is not about erasing the scar. It's about seeing the scar and choosing to love the damaged structure anyway." The old cedar fence stood in the yard for many years, never repaired, never painted a monument. Thomas grew not into a carpenter like his father, but a teacher. He excelled at the difficult, fragile work of guiding children, particularly those struggling with the volcanic hearts he knew so well. He became known for his quiet patience and his absolute refusal to engage in verbal conflict. When colleagues or students lashed out, Thomas would lean back, his eyes distant, as if viewing a very old, scarred cedar fence only he could see. He knew the cost of every nail. In his late 20s, Thomas returned home for the holidays. David, now aged, led him out to the old fence. It was finally falling apart, weathered by decades of sun and rain. "It's time to take it down," David said, "and build a new one." Thomas looked at the old, holy relic of his childhood. The original holes, once stark and dark, had softened, rounded by time, and filled with moss and tiny, harmless insects. The patches of putty were now a uniform gray. The fence was beautiful, not in spite of its scars, but because of them. "I'll help you," Thomas said, as they worked, prying the planks from the rotten supports. Thomas found something he hadn't seen since that fateful summer, the point of that bent, rusted nail that had broken off. It was almost consumed by the wood, but it was still there, a tiny, sharp, metallic shard. He handed it to his father. David held the fragment, turning it over in his calloused palm. "Some stay with you forever, even after the wood has turned to dust." Thomas nodded, the memory of his shame and his triumph equally vivid. Together, they built a new fence, using pristine, smooth, treated pine. It was strong and flawless. But when they were finished, Thomas did something David had not expected. He took the smallest piece of cedar from the old fence, the plank that had held the 37 nails, and carefully planed it down. He took the small, scarred piece, sealed it with varnish, and hung it over the mantel in his own living room. Whenever Thomas felt the old familiar heat of frustration rising, whenever a difficult conversation loomed, he would look at that small, scarred block of wood. It was a tangible reminder that the easiest action, the shout, the cruel word, the fit of rage carries the heaviest, most enduring consequence. He was no longer a man defined by the hammer, but a man defined by the careful, thoughtful pause. A man whose life's work was to ensure that his words, unlike the sharp iron nails of his youth, would always leave the world a little more whole than he found it. The old fence, though gone, had taught him that kindness wasn't the absence of anger, but the relentless, disciplined, day-by-day commitment to preventing the first wound.